Tonight we're diving into something deliciously dark. A world of crowns and conspiracies, of queens who didn't just wear their titles, they wielded them like weapons. We're talking about the medieval women who refused to sit quietly in their chambers, embroidering tapestries while men decided the fate of kingdoms. These weren't the fairy tale princesses you grew up with. These were women who poisoned rivals, led armies into battle, overthrew their own husbands, and sparked civil wars that left thousands dead in their wake. So before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights, grab a blanket, and settle in. If you're enjoying what we do here, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always amazing to see our community spreading across the globe, all of us gathered here in the quiet hours to explore the shadows of history. The medieval period loved nothing more than a good scandal. In a world without television, without social media, without even widespread literacy, gossip was the original viral content. And when that gossip involved queens, women who held positions of power in societies that fundamentally believed women should have none, the stories took on a life of their own. They grew teeth, they developed claws, they became legends that have echoed down through the centuries, often drowning out the actual truth beneath layers of propaganda, misogyny, and political manoeuvring. Tonight, we're examining 5 queens whose lives were so scandalous, so controversial, and so absolutely fascinating that their names became synonymous with everything medieval society feared about women in power. Some led invasions against their own countries, others were accused of witchcraft, adultery, even incest. They murdered rivals, plotted coups, and refused to fade quietly into the background when their husbands proved incompetent, insane, or simply inconvenient. But here's what makes these stories truly compelling. As we peel back the layers of propaganda and posthumous character assassination, we discover something remarkable. Many of these so-called scandalous queens were actually brilliant political operators, devoted mothers fighting to secure their children's inheritance, or simply women trying to survive in a brutally patriarchal system that offered them impossible choices. They were vilified not necessarily because they were evil, but because they dared to exercise power in a world that believed power belonged exclusively to men. The label she-wolf appears again and again in medieval chronicles, applied to queens who stepped outside their prescribed roles. It's a fascinating term, dripping with both fear and begrudging respect. A she-wolf protects her young viciously, tears apart threats without hesitation, and refuses to submit. To medieval chroniclers, often celibate monks writing decades after the events, this animalistic comparison served to dehumanize these women, to suggest they'd abandoned their God-given femininity for something monstrous and unnatural. But wolves, as we know now, are actually devoted parents, strategic hunters, and fiercely loyal to their packs. Maybe the comparison was more accurate than those medieval monks intended. Maybe these queens were exactly what their kingdoms needed. Fierce protectors willing to do whatever it took to ensure survival in an era when political defeat often meant total annihilation. As we count down from number 5 to number 1, you'll notice patterns emerging. Foreign queens were automatically suspect, their every action viewed through a lens of xenophobic paranoia. Queens who dared to lead armies or participate in governance were accused of being unnatural, of inverting the proper order of things, and queens who outlived their usefulness, whether because they'd failed to produce male heirs or because powerful men found them inconvenient, often faced accusations that sound almost comically absurd to modern ears, but were deadly serious in their time. These 5 women lived centuries apart, ruled different kingdoms, and faced unique challenges. But they share something profound. They all refused to accept the limitations placed on their gender. They all paid a terrible price for that refusal, and they all left legacies that have fascinated and horrified people for generations. So let's begin our descent into medieval scandal, power, and the dangerous game of queenship. Let's meet the women history tried to forget, or failing that, tried to transform into monsters. Let's discover what really happened when queens decided that survival mattered more than propriety, that protecting their children's future justified any means necessary, and that crowns, once worn, were worth fighting to keep. If you know anything about the Wars of the Roses, you've probably heard the name Margaret of Anjou, and if you've heard her name, there's a good chance it was followed by words like ruthless, bloodthirsty, or Shakespeare's famous epithet, she-wolf of France. But who was she really? A power-hungry queen who prolonged a devastating civil war for her own ambition, or a mother desperately fighting to protect her son's inheritance against men who would have happily seen him dead? Margaret's story begins far from the blood-soaked battlefields where it would eventually play out. Born on March 23rd, 1430, in the Duchy of Lorraine, she was the daughter of René of Anjou, who held the gloriously impressive titles of King of Naples, Sicily and Jerusalem. The catch? He didn't actually control any of those kingdoms. René was what you might call an aspirational monarch, a man of many crowns but no actual kingdoms to speak of. Margaret grew up in this world of noble pretense, in the castles of Provence and the old royal palace at Capua, learning from her mother Isabella and possibly from the scholar Antoine de La Salle. Her childhood was spent reading French romances and hunting, pursuits that would seem almost quaint given what was coming. Her family had a tradition of powerful women, several of whom had exercised real authority as regents and administrators. So when marriage negotiations began, young Margaret wasn't entering queenship as a naive innocent. She'd been raised in a family where women understood that influence was something you seized, not something you waited to be given. In 1445, when Margaret was just 15 years old, she married Henry VI of England. This was supposed to be a diplomatic triumph, a union that would bring peace between England and France as the 100 Years' War finally wheezed to its exhausted conclusion. The marriage was negotiated by William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, who would become one of Margaret's most important early allies. Henry himself was 23, pious, scholarly, and fundamentally unsuited to the brutal realities of medieval kingship. Here's what contemporary sources tell us about Henry. He was more interested in founding colleges and supporting religious institutions than in the messy business of governing a fractious nobility or maintaining England's crumbling empire in France. Chroniclers described him as gentle, devout, and so opposed to violence that he would sometimes cover his eyes during tournaments. These aren't exactly the qualities medieval subjects looked for in their king. England had recently been ruled by Henry V, the warrior king who'd won Agincourt and carved out a French empire. His son was a bookish introvert who preferred prayer to politics. Margaret, by contrast, was described as passionate, strong-willed and proud from the moment she arrived in England. This was no shrinking violet preparing to fade into the background. She understood her role. She was expected to help Henry recover the French territories England had lost. She was a champion of the crown, ready to defend it with every tool at her disposal. It's fortunate she felt that way, because she was going to need every ounce of that determination. The early years of the marriage passed relatively peacefully, though Margaret's failure to produce an heir quickly became a source of concern. Then, in August 1453, everything changed. Henry suffered a complete mental breakdown. We don't know exactly what happened to him. Some historians have suggested catatonic schizophrenia. Others point to symptoms more consistent with a severe depressive episode, or what might now be diagnosed as a dissociative disorder. What we do know is that the King of England suddenly couldn't speak, couldn't recognise anyone, and couldn't perform even the most basic functions of his role. Just months later, in October 1453, Margaret gave birth to a son, Edward of Westminster. Under normal circumstances, this would have been cause for celebration. The long-awaited heir had arrived. But Henry couldn't acknowledge the child. He couldn't speak to, proclaim Edward as his son. And in the vicious world of medieval politics, people immediately began whispering that perhaps the baby wasn't Henry's at all. These rumours would follow Margaret for the rest of her life, despite there being absolutely no concrete evidence to support them. The accusations seem to have stemmed entirely from the convenient timing and from the fact that powerful men found it useful to question Edward's legitimacy. With Henry incapacitated, someone needed to govern the kingdom. Margaret believed, reasonably, that she should be appointed regent. She was the Queen, the mother of the heir, intelligent and capable. But Parliament disagreed. Instead, they gave the regency to Richard, Duke of York, who happened to have his own claim to the throne through his descent from Edward III. York had better Plantagenet bloodlines than Henry, and he knew it. He'd been chafing for years at being excluded from real power, and now he finally had his chance. Margaret was furious. She'd been denied what she believed was her rightful role, and York was now in position to potentially disinherit her infant son. When Henry eventually recovered his wits enough to acknowledge Edward as his heir, the damage had been done. Margaret had learned that Parliament and the nobility would never willingly grant her authority. If she wanted to protect her son's inheritance, she would have to seize power, not wait for it to be given. What followed were the Wars of the Roses, that decades-long dynastic nightmare that pitted the House of Lancaster, Henry's family, against the House of York in a series of bloody battles for the English throne. And Margaret wasn't sitting in a castle somewhere waiting for news. She was actively leading the Lancastrian faction, raising armies, forging alliances, and making strategic decisions. This was unprecedented. Queens might occasionally serve as regents when their sons were minors, but they didn't lead military campaigns. They didn't personally negotiate with Scottish kings or French monarchs. They didn't ride at the head of armies. Margaret did all of this, and she did it because she had no choice. Her husband was intermittently insane. Her son was young and threatened, and the alternative was to sit by passively while the Yorkists destroyed everything. In 1455, the First Battle of St Albans kicked off the shooting war. York's forces killed several of Margaret's key allies, including Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. Henry, who'd been with the Yorkist army, suffered another mental collapse. Margaret's response was to consolidate power, surrounding herself with loyalists and effectively becoming the real power behind the throne. For the next several years, Margaret dominated English politics. She called the Parliament known as the Loveday Parliament in 1458, a desperate attempt to reconcile the feuding factions that predictably failed. She made and broke alliances with ruthless efficiency, and she made enemies, lots of them. Here's where the she-wolf reputation really solidifies. After the Second Battle of St Albans in 1461, Margaret's forces captured several Yorkist nobles, including Lord Bonville and Sir Thomas Kyriel, who'd been guarding Henry during his captivity with the Yorkists. Margaret allegedly had her 7-year-old son, Prince Edward, pass judgment on these men. When asked what death they deserved, the boy reportedly said, "Their heads should be cut off." The executions were carried out immediately. Whether this story is true is debatable. It appears in Yorkist propaganda written after Margaret's faction lost the war, and victors aren't known for objective historical accounts. But true or not, it became part of Margaret's legend. She was the cruel queen who forced a child to order executions, the foreign woman with no mercy in her heart. Actually, let's talk about that foreign woman angle. Margaret was French, and she never let anyone forget it. She maintained connections with the French court throughout her time in England, using those connections to secure military and financial support. To English subjects already resentful about losing their French territories, this looked like exactly what it was. A French queen putting French interests ahead of English ones. Chroniclers regularly referred to her as the French woman, in terms dripping with contempt. The problem was that Margaret didn't really have another option. The English nobility was divided, and her husband's intermittent lucidity made him an unreliable ally at best. France was the one place she could consistently turn for help. But every time she did, it reinforced the narrative that she was a foreign infiltrator, destroying England from within. The tide turned decisively against Margaret at the Battle of Towton in 1461, one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil. Estimates suggest around 28,000 men died in a single day of fighting in a snowstorm. The Lancastrians lost, and lost badly. Edward, Earl of March, York's son, declared himself King Edward IV. Henry, Margaret and Prince Edward fled north, eventually escaping to Scotland and then to France. For the next 9 years, Margaret lived in exile, constantly scheming to reclaim the throne for her husband and son. She negotiated with Margaret of Anjou of Scotland, she dealt with Louis XI of France, and she even forged an unlikely alliance with Warwick the Kingmaker, who'd broken with Edward IV. In 1470, they actually pulled it off. Henry VI was briefly restored to the throne in what's known as the Redemption, but it didn't last. Edward IV invaded England with Burgundian support in 1471. At the Battle of Barnet, Warwick died, and then came the final, crushing blow. At the Battle of Tewkesbury on May 4, 1471, the Lancastrian forces were destroyed. Margaret's son Edward, the prince she'd fought for all these years, was killed. Some accounts say he died in battle. Others claim he was executed afterward, murdered by Edward IV's brothers, including the future Richard III. Margaret was captured and held in the Tower of London. Her husband Henry VI died days later, officially of melancholy, but almost certainly murdered. Margaret had lost everything. Her husband, her son, her cause. She was eventually ransomed by Louis XI and returned to France, where she lived in poverty for the last 7 years of her life, dying in 1482. So, what's the truth about Margaret of Anjou? Was she the she-wolf, the bloodthirsty foreign queen who prolonged a civil war out of ambition? Or was she a mother doing what any parent would do, fighting with everything she had to protect her child's inheritance? Modern historians increasingly lean toward the latter interpretation. When you actually compare Margaret's body count to that of her male contemporaries, she comes off looking positively restrained. At most, she can be directly connected to 3 executions after St Albans. Meanwhile, Edward IV executed dozens after Tewkesbury, Richard III had multiple people killed without trial, and Warwick the Kingmaker was notorious for post-battle executions. The difference was that when Margaret ordered deaths, she was transgressing gender norms. She was a woman behaving like a military commander, and medieval society found that monstrous. When men did the exact same things, it was just politics as usual. Shakespeare, writing more than a century after Margaret's death, immortalised the she-wolf characterisation in his Henry VI plays. His Margaret is a manipulative, cruel adulteress who carries around the severed head of her lover, the Duke of Suffolk. Never mind that there's no historical evidence for the affair Shakespeare invents between them. Never mind that Shakespeare was writing propaganda for the Tudor dynasty, which had its own reasons for vilifying the House of Lancaster. The image stuck. Today, Margaret's reputation is undergoing a rehabilitation. Historians recognise that she was trapped in an impossible situation, married to a king who couldn't rule, mother to an heir whose legitimacy was constantly questioned, foreign-born in a country that despised her origins, and operating in a system that gave her no legitimate path to power. She didn't start the Wars of the Roses. The conflict's roots lay in Richard of York's ambition and the weakness of Henry VI's kingship. But she fought in them with everything she had, because what else was she going to do? Margaret's tragedy wasn't that she was monstrous. It was that she was competent, strategic, and determined in an era that found those qualities acceptable in men and terrifying in women. She wasn't perfect, she made mistakes, formed bad alliances, and yes, probably did order some executions that might be considered war crimes by modern standards. But she was fighting for survival in a world where losing meant the total destruction of her family line. Under those circumstances, perfect morality is a luxury nobody could afford. The she-wolf of France wasn't a she-wolf at all. She was a woman playing a game designed to be unwinnable for someone of her gender, and she came far closer to winning than anyone had any right to expect. That she ultimately lost doesn't diminish the remarkable fact that she fought at all. Let's talk about Joan of Navarre, a queen whose story perfectly illustrates how vulnerable even the most powerful women could be in medieval Europe. Joan's scandal wasn't about sexual impropriety or military ambition. It was about something even more dangerous in the medieval imagination: witchcraft. Joan was born around 1370, the daughter of King Charles II of Navarre, a small but strategically important kingdom straddling the Pyrenees between France and Spain. Her first marriage was to John IV, Duke of Brittany, in 1386. By all accounts, this was a successful partnership. Joan bore John 9 children, managed his affairs when he was absent, and earned a reputation for intelligence and capability. When John died in 1399, Joan was well into her 30s, a widow with a large family and significant property. What happened next raises eyebrows even today. Henry IV of England, who just usurped the English throne from Richard II in a coup, began courting Joan almost immediately. Henry was recently widowed himself, facing political opposition on all sides, and in desperate need of allies and legitimacy. Joan, as Duchess of Brittany, controlled resources and alliances that Henry badly needed. They married in 1403, a union that made Joan Queen of England. She was already in her 30s, considered quite old by medieval standards for a remarriage, especially to a king. She brought her children from her first marriage to England, and by all accounts she and Henry had a respectful, if not passionate, relationship. Joan involved herself in court life, managed her considerable dower lands, and seemed to be settling into the role of queen consort quite comfortably. Henry IV died in 1413, and his son became Henry V. This is where things get complicated. As Queen Dowager, Joan was entitled to maintain her dower lands and the substantial income they generated. This wasn't pocket money. Joan's annual income from these lands was around 10,000 marks, an enormous sum that made her one of the wealthiest women in England. Henry V, meanwhile, was preparing for his campaigns in France, the same France where Joan had family connections, the same France that might prove useful to Henry if he could access the wealth currently flowing to his stepmother. And Joan was foreign-born, Navarrese with French connections, in a country that was growing increasingly suspicious of foreign influences at court. In 1419, 7 years into Joan's widowhood, the accusations came. The Queen Dowager was arrested and charged with attempting to kill the king through necromancy and witchcraft. According to the charges, Joan had been consulting with practitioners of dark magic, attempting to harm or even kill Henry V through occult means. These accusations were, to put it mildly, absurd. Joan was a devout Christian, known for her piety and charitable works. She had no motive to kill Henry, who by all accounts treated her respectfully and maintained good relationships with her children from her first marriage. Several of her sons actually served in Henry's army in France. Why would she want to harm him? The answer, of course, had nothing to do with actual witchcraft and everything to do with money and politics. Henry V was spending enormous sums on his French campaigns. Joan's dower lands represented a significant pool of wealth that could be redirected toward the war effort if Joan could be removed from the picture, and the witchcraft charges provided perfect justification. Here's the really telling detail. When Joan was arrested, her income from her dower lands was immediately seized by the crown. She wasn't burned at the stake, despite witchcraft theoretically being a capital offence. She wasn't subjected to torture to extract a confession, the usual practice in witchcraft cases. She wasn't even put on trial. Instead, she was confined to various castles under house arrest, maintained in relative comfort, but with absolutely no access to her wealth or freedom. Joan spent the next 3.5 years in captivity. Henry V died in 1422, having never actually prosecuted the case against her. His infant son became Henry VI, with a regency council governing in his name, and finally in 1422 Joan was released. The charges were quietly dropped, She was restored to most, though notably not all, of her lands, and she lived out the rest of her life in relative peace, dying in 1437. So, what really happened? The consensus among modern historians is that this was a straightforward case of politically motivated theft. Henry V needed money for his wars, Joan had money, and accusing her of witchcraft provided a legally acceptable way to seize her assets. The fact that she was foreign-born made the accusations easier to sell to a xenophobic public. But let's talk about why witchcraft specifically. In medieval Europe, accusations of witchcraft were the ultimate weapon against women, particularly women of power and wealth. Witchcraft inverted the natural order. It was evil specifically associated with feminine malice, sexual transgression, and cooperation with demonic forces. A woman accused of witchcraft wasn't just a criminal, she was a traitor to her gender, to her Christian faith, and to the social order itself. Crucially, witchcraft accusations were almost impossible to disprove. How do you prove you haven't been consulting with demons? How do you demonstrate that you haven't been attempting to harm someone through occult means? The evidence was always circumstantial, strange occurrences, illnesses, bad luck that happened to afflict the accuser or their allies. Once accused, you were operating from a position of assumed guilt. For Joan, the accusations were particularly cruel because they struck at her greatest strength, her reputation for piety and virtue. She was known as a charitable woman, deeply religious, devoted to good works. The witchcraft charges flipped that narrative completely, suggesting that her public piety was a mask hiding her true demonic nature. And here's another layer of the scandal. Joan's household at the time of her arrest included several people who were also accused, including her confessor and her son. The implication was that she'd corrupted those around her, spreading her evil influence through the court. This was a standard feature of witchcraft accusations, the idea that witchcraft was socially contagious, spreading from person to person like a disease. The gendered nature of these accusations can't be overstated. Men could be accused of witchcraft, but it was far rarer. When men were accused, it was usually of high magic, learned necromancy that required education and study. Women were accused of low magic, intuitive evil learned from older women or directly from demons, often with sexual overtones. Joan's case also reveals something important about the precarious position of dowager queens. Once her husband died, Joan had no real power base of her own. She was entirely dependent on the goodwill of her stepson and the broader political establishment to maintain her status and income. The moment that goodwill evaporated, she had no real recourse. She couldn't raise an army like Margaret of Anjou would later do. She couldn't flee to her home kingdom, as she was in her 60s by this point. All she could do was endure captivity and hope for eventual vindication. The fact that she was eventually released and restored suggests that even Henry V's government recognised the accusations were politically rather than legally motivated. If they'd actually believed she was practising witchcraft, they would have put her on trial and executed her. Instead, they just held her until they'd extracted the wealth they needed from her lands. Joan of Navarre's scandal teaches us something crucial about medieval queenship. Even the most apparently stable and respectable queen could find herself accused, imprisoned, and stripped of everything she owned on the flimsiest of pretexts. Her foreign birth made her vulnerable to xenophobic suspicions. Her wealth made her a target for financially desperate governments. And her gender meant that accusations of witchcraft, which would have been laughable against a man of her status, were considered entirely plausible against her. She wasn't scandalous because she did anything wrong. She was scandalous because powerful men found it convenient to make her so. That's a lesson that applies to more than a few of the queens on this list. If there's one medieval queen whose name has become synonymous with scandal, brilliance, and sheer stubborn survival, it's Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born around 1122, Eleanor lived into her 80s, a remarkable feat for the medieval period, and she spent those decades accumulating an absolutely staggering number of titles, accomplishments, and controversies. Let's start with what made Eleanor different from almost every other woman in medieval Europe. When her father, Duke William of Aquitaine, died in 1137, 15-year-old Eleanor inherited one of the largest and wealthiest territories in France. Aquitaine stretched across much of southwestern France, from the Loire Valley down to the Pyrenees. It was larger and richer than the territory controlled by the French king himself. Eleanor wasn't just a duchess in title. She actually ruled Aquitaine, and she never let anyone forget it. Throughout her life, no matter what other titles she accumulated, she always styled herself primarily as Duchess of Aquitaine. That was her identity, her power base, and her legacy. Just weeks after inheriting Aquitaine, Eleanor married Louis, the heir to the French throne, who became King Louis VII within days of their wedding. Suddenly at 15, Eleanor wasn't just a duchess, she was Queen of France. And by all accounts, she was the worst possible match for Louis VII. Louis VII was pious to the point of asceticism, essentially a monk who'd been forced into kingship when his older brother died. He wore hair shirts, did penance constantly, and approached his royal duties with grim determination rather than any apparent joy. Eleanor, by contrast, was vivacious, cultured, and had grown up in the famously libertine court of Aquitaine, where troubadours sang love songs, women participated in governance, and people actually seemed to enjoy life. Their marriage lasted 15 years and produced 2 daughters but no sons, a critical failure in medieval royal marriages. But it's not the lack of a male heir that makes Eleanor's first marriage scandalous. It's what happened during the Second Crusade. In 1147, Pope Eugene III called for a crusade to defend the Crusader states in the Holy Land. Louis, being Louis, immediately volunteered to lead the French forces, and Eleanor, being Eleanor, announced she was coming too. This was not normal. Queens did not go on crusades. Eleanor didn't care. She recruited her own retinue of ladies from the Aquitanian nobility, essentially creating a female crusading contingent. Chroniclers lost their minds over this. The monk who wrote about the crusade complained that the French army became an immense train of women and baggage that slowed everything down and distracted the noble warriors from their holy mission. Eleanor and her ladies were described variously as dressed like Amazons, riding horses, and generally behaving in ways that were absolutely not appropriate for Christian noblewomen on a holy pilgrimage. But the real scandal happened in Antioch. The crusading army reached the city in 1148, where they were welcomed by Prince Raymond of Poitiers. Here's where things get complicated. Raymond was Eleanor's uncle, the younger son of her grandfather William IX. He'd left Aquitaine years earlier to seek his fortune and had become one of the most powerful rulers in the Latin East. Eleanor and Raymond spent considerable time together during the army's stay in Antioch. They had long conversations, they consulted on military strategy, and they clearly enjoyed each other's company. And this is where the rumours start. John of Salisbury and William of Tyre, chroniclers writing about the Crusade, hint heavily that Eleanor and Raymond became lovers, committing incest in one of Christianity's holiest conflicts. How much truth is there to these rumours? Honestly, we'll never know for certain. What we do know is that Eleanor and Raymond definitely disagreed with Louis about military strategy. Raymond wanted to attack Aleppo, which would have helped secure Antioch's position. Louis wanted to go straight to Jerusalem to complete his pilgrimage. Eleanor sided with her uncle, publicly arguing with her husband about the direction of the crusade. Here's the really scandalous part. When Louis decided to leave Antioch abruptly, Eleanor announced she wanted to stay. She asked to remain under her uncle's protection rather than continue with her husband. In medieval terms, this was explosive. A wife choosing her uncle over her husband, a queen publicly breaking with her king. Unthinkable. Louis reportedly ordered Eleanor seized and forcibly taken from Antioch. The image of the Queen of France being physically dragged away from her uncle's city while protesting, that's the kind of scene that generates rumours. Whether Eleanor and Raymond actually had a sexual relationship is almost beside the point. What mattered was that people believed they did, or at least found it useful to say they did. The crusade itself was a disaster. achieving none of its objectives. The return journey was even worse, with Eleanor and Louis travelling on separate ships. When they finally reached the papal court in Italy, Eleanor was ready. She asked Pope Eugene for an annulment, claiming consanguinity. They were fourth cousins, which was technically within the prohibited degrees of relation. Eugene refused to grant the annulment immediately. He tried to reconcile the couple, even reportedly putting them in the same bed to encourage them to work on their marriage. But it was hopeless. Eleanor wanted out, and eventually in 1152 she got her wish. The marriage was annulled on grounds of consanguinity. Here's where Eleanor proves she's an absolute political genius. Within 8 weeks of her annulment from Louis VII, she married Henry of Normandy, who was 11 years her junior and about to become King of England. This wasn't just any remarriage. This was a calculated, political alliance that changed the map of Europe. When Henry became Henry II of England in 1154, Eleanor became Queen of England while maintaining her position as Duchess of Aquitaine. The Angevin Empire, as their combined territories came to be known, stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. It was the largest and most powerful political entity in Western Europe, and Eleanor was at its centre. Eleanor and Henry had 8 children together, including future kings Richard I and John. For about 15 years they were partners in governing this vast empire. Eleanor held court in Poitiers, the capital of Aquitaine, where she became a patron of troubadours and allegedly established the famous Court of Love, though this might be more legend than fact. The Court of Love, if it existed, was supposedly a place where questions of courtly romance were debated and judged by Eleanor and her daughter Marie. Love problems would be presented, and the noble ladies would render judgments on proper conduct in romantic relationships. Did it really exist? Probably not in the formal way described by the 12th century writer Andreas Capellanus. But Eleanor definitely created a cultural centre in Poitiers that celebrated poetry, music, and the literature of courtly love. But then the marriage between Eleanor and Henry started to deteriorate. Henry was serially unfaithful, most notably with a woman named Rosamund Clifford, who he housed in a palace and visited openly. Eleanor moved her primary residence to Poitiers, effectively separating from Henry while maintaining her political position. In 1173, Eleanor's 3 oldest surviving sons, Henry the young king, Richard and Geoffrey, revolted against their father, and Eleanor supported them. This wasn't a mother reluctantly going along with her children's bad decisions. Eleanor actively encouraged the rebellion, using her considerable influence and the resources of Aquitaine to support her sons against their father. The rebellion failed, and Henry II was not amused. He had Eleanor arrested and imprisoned. For the next 16 years Eleanor was held captive, moved between various castles as it suited Henry. She wasn't tortured or living in a dungeon. She was a royal prisoner, kept in comfortable but closely guarded quarters. But she was absolutely, definitively not free. Think about that for a moment. One of the most powerful women in Europe, a woman who'd been Queen of France and Queen of England, was imprisoned by her own husband for 16 years. No trial, no legal process, just a king exercising his absolute authority over a wife who'd committed the unforgivable sin of opposing him politically. Eleanor was released in 1189 when Henry II died, and her favourite son, Richard I, became king. She was 67 years old and had spent 16 years in captivity. Most people would have retired at that point, but Eleanor was just getting started. She served as regent while Richard went on, the Third Crusade governing England with remarkable skill. When Richard was captured and held for ransom on his return journey, Eleanor personally oversaw the collection of the massive sum needed to free him. After Richard's death in 1199, Eleanor's least favourite son, John, became king. She was in her late 70s by this point, but she still involved herself in politics, travelling across Aquitaine to shore up support for John's rule. She retired to Fontevraud Abbey, a religious house where she'd been a patron for years, and died there in 1204. So let's tally up Eleanor's scandals. She allegedly had an incestuous affair with her uncle during a crusade. She divorced the King of France and immediately remarried, a move considered shockingly fast by contemporary standards. She supported her sons in armed rebellion against her husband. She was imprisoned for 16 years as a political threat. And if the rumours are to be believed, she might have had numerous other affairs throughout her life. But here's what's fascinating. Eleanor was never accused of witchcraft, despite doing things that would have gotten other queens burned at the stake. She was never seriously accused of murdering anyone, though she certainly had the opportunity and motive during various political crises. Instead, she was accused primarily of sexual impropriety and political overreach. Why did Eleanor survive when so many other powerful medieval queens didn't? Part of it was her wealth and power. Aquitaine gave her resources and a power base that even a king couldn't fully suppress. Part of it was her intelligence. She knew how to forge alliances, when to advance and when to retreat, and how to stay essential to the men who technically ruled over her. But part of it was also luck. She lived long enough to outlast her enemies. She bore enough sons that her value as a mother of heirs outweighed any scandal, and she existed in a moment when the structure of medieval power was just flexible enough to accommodate a woman of extraordinary ability, provided that woman was willing to pay the price. Eleanor's real scandal wasn't any of the specific accusations levelled against her. It was that she refused to be limited by her gender in an era when women, even queens, were expected to be ornamental and obedient. She ruled territories, made alliances, waged wars, and survived to become one of the most famous women of the Middle Ages. That's what medieval society found truly scandalous about Eleanor. Not that she might have had affairs or supported rebellions, but that she insisted on being a player in the Game of Thrones when women were supposed to be prizes to be won. If Margaret of Anjou was called the she-wolf of France, it was only because Isabella of France had established the template 150 years earlier. Born around 1295, Isabella was the daughter of Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair for his remarkable good looks, though not notably for his warm personality. Philip was described by one chronicler as neither a man nor a beast, but a statue, giving you some sense of the emotional warmth of Isabella's childhood. Her mother, Joan I of Navarre, died when Isabella was young, amid dark rumours that Philip himself might have killed her, though these rumours are almost certainly untrue. Still, it meant Isabella grew up in a court that was beautiful, powerful, and fundamentally cold. She learned early that politics was a game played without sentiment, a lesson that would serve her well in the years to come. In 1308, at just 12 years old, Isabella was married to Edward II of England. This was supposed to cement peace between England and France, two kingdoms that had been at each other's throats for generations. Isabella arrived at Boulogne-sur-Mer for her wedding, wearing gorgeous clothes, bringing gold crowns and dinnerware, and a dowry befitting a French princess. She was described as exceptionally beautiful, with one chronicler calling her the beauty of beauties in the kingdom, if not in all Europe. The wedding itself was a magnificent affair. Edward and Isabella were married in the cathedral at Boulogne, with all the pomp and ceremony befitting a royal union. And then they travelled to England for Isabella's coronation, which should have been one of the most important days of her young life. Instead, it became her first public humiliation. At both the wedding feast and the coronation, Edward II sat not with his new 12-year-old bride, but with his favourite, Piers Gaveston. He gave Gaveston jewellery that had been intended for Isabella, jewellery that Gaveston then wore publicly. He arranged for the wedding pavilions to display not just the royal arms of England and France, but also Gaveston's personal heraldry, elevating his favourite to equal status with Isabella. And he generally made it abundantly clear to everyone present that his interest lay elsewhere. Here's where we need to talk about Edward II and his favourites. The relationship between Edward and Piers Gaveston has been debated by historians for centuries. Were they lovers? Adoptive brothers? Just very close friends? The truth is, we'll never know for certain, as anything more than friendship would have been so transgressive in medieval England that it would have been hidden, and any records destroyed. What we do know is that Edward showered Gaveston with titles, lands, and affection to a degree that scandalised his court and infuriated his barons. He made Gaveston Earl of Cornwall, one of the highest titles in the realm. He trusted Gaveston to govern in his absence, and he openly preferred Gaveston's company to that of his wife, his nobles, or anyone else. Isabella, who was still a child herself, tried to make the best of it. She formed a working relationship with Gaveston, using her connection to him to maintain some influence at court. But the English barons weren't having it. They viewed Gaveston as a low-born upstart who'd corrupted their king. Several times they forced Edward to exile Gaveston, and each time Edward either found a way to bring him back or simply disobeyed the order once the barons' attention was elsewhere. The situation reached a breaking point in 1312. A group of nobles led by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, captured Gaveston and executed him without trial. Edward was devastated. Isabella, now about 17 years old, had lost her most useful ally at court, and the kingdom descended into conflict between the king and his rebellious barons. Throughout this period, Isabella bore Edward 4 children. Their first son, the future Edward III, was born in 1312. She also bore John of Eltham and daughters Eleanor and Joan. The fact that she was clearly having sexual relations with Edward suggests their relationship wasn't entirely loveless, or at least that both understood their dynastic duty to produce heirs. After Gaveston's death, Edward found new favourites, and this is where things went from bad to catastrophic for Isabella. Hugh Despenser the younger and his father, Hugh Despenser the elder, became Edward's new closest advisors. Unlike Gaveston, who at least had some charm, the Despensers were widely hated, rapacious, and utterly corrupt. They used their influence over Edward to enrich themselves, seizing lands from other nobles and accumulating enormous wealth and power. The Despensers quickly identified Isabella as a threat. She had her own lands, her own income, and most importantly her own connections to the French royal family. In 1324, they convinced Edward to confiscate Isabella's lands and income, ostensibly because war was brewing with France. Isabella's French attendants were sent away, replaced with English servants loyal to the Despensers. Her children were taken from her care and placed in the custody of the Despensers. She was, in effect, a prisoner in her own household. Isabella wrote to Edward, begging him to intercede to restore her income and her children. He did nothing. The King of England had allowed his favourites to strip his queen of everything she owned and controlled. It was an extraordinary humiliation, and it turned Isabella from a woman trying to make the best of a bad marriage into an enemy bent on revenge. The opportunity came in 1325. England and France were on the brink of war over English-controlled territories in France. Someone needed to travel to France to negotiate with King Charles IV, who happened to be Isabella's brother. Edward couldn't go himself because he didn't trust leaving the Despensers behind, and they were so universally hated that he couldn't guarantee their safety in his absence. So Isabella offered to go as his emissary. As Charles's sister, she argued, she was perfectly positioned to negotiate. Edward agreed, probably delighted to have her gone and out of the way. Isabella travelled to France in March 1325, and from the moment she arrived she had absolutely no intention of ever coming back. In France, Isabella found herself surrounded by English exiles, including Roger Mortimer, a powerful baron who'd escaped from the Tower of London, where Edward had imprisoned him for rebellion. Mortimer was everything Edward wasn't: capable, masculine, decisive. He was also married, but that apparently wasn't going to stop either of them. Isabella and Mortimer became lovers. We don't know exactly when the relationship began, but by late 1325, it was apparently an open secret. Charles IV, Isabella's brother, received complaints from the Pope about Isabella's scandalous behaviour at the French court. She wasn't just refusing to return to England, she was living openly with an English exile and making a spectacle of herself. Charles kicked her out, unwilling to be associated with his sister's affair. But Isabella had already made other arrangements. She travelled to the court of William II, Count of Hainault, and negotiated an alliance. She would marry her teenage son Edward to William's daughter Philippa. In exchange, William would provide men, ships, and money for an invasion of England. Let's pause here to appreciate the audacity of what Isabella was doing. The Queen of England was living openly with her lover in exile, negotiating foreign alliances without her husband's knowledge, and planning an actual invasion of her husband's kingdom. This wasn't a scandal. This was treason on an epic scale. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England with a small force. Edward tried to raise an army to oppose them, but he couldn't. The Despensers were so universally hated that nobody would fight for them. As Isabella's force marched across England, the country rose to support her. Nobles joined her cause. Cities opened their gates. It was less an invasion and more a triumphal procession. Edward and the Despensers fled west, trying to escape to Ireland. They didn't make it. Hugh Despenser the Elder was captured in Bristol and executed. Edward and Hugh Despenser the Younger were captured in Wales. Despenser the Younger was tried and convicted of treason, then executed in Hereford in a particularly gruesome manner involving being hanged, drawn and quartered while still alive. Isabella now controlled the kingdom, but she had a problem. Edward was still technically king, and under medieval law there was no legitimate way to remove him. You couldn't just depose a king because he was incompetent or married to his favourites rather than his wife. The kingship was divinely granted, permanent until death. In January 1327, Parliament was summoned. Edward refused to attend, probably terrified of what would happen if he showed his face. The next morning, articles of accusation were produced listing Edward's failures as king. He was condemned and deposed, the first time an English monarch had been removed from the throne without being killed in battle or dying naturally. Edward II abdicated in favour of his 14-year-old son, who became Edward III, with Isabella and Mortimer serving as regents, and then Edward II disappeared into captivity at Berkeley Castle. In September 1327, it was announced that he had died. The official cause was given as natural causes, but nobody believed it. The general assumption was that Edward had been murdered, and the question was only whether Isabella had ordered it or merely permitted it. Rumours swirled for years about the manner of his death, with the most notorious story claiming he'd been murdered with a red-hot poker thrust into his anus, a death meant to echo his supposed sexual transgressions. Modern historians think this story is almost certainly false, possibly invented decades later. Some even argue that Edward II might have escaped and lived out his days in hiding as William the Welshman. Regardless, Edward was gone, and Isabella ruled England as regent for her teenage son. For 3 years she and Mortimer governed together, and they weren't subtle about their relationship. They appeared together publicly, shared the same castles, and generally behaved as though they were married in all but name. Mortimer accumulated titles and wealth with astonishing speed, making himself de facto ruler of England. But they made mistakes. A peace treaty with Scotland that recognised Scottish independence was wildly unpopular. There were suspicions about Edward II's death that wouldn't go away, and most crucially they underestimated Edward III. When Isabella and Mortimer executed Edward III's uncle, Edmund Earl of Kent, on trumped-up charges of treason, they went too far. In October 1330, the 17-year-old king struck. He led a group of trusted nobles through secret passages beneath Nottingham Castle, surprising Isabella and Mortimer in Isabella's apartments. Mortimer was arrested. Isabella reportedly screamed, "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer," but Edward ignored her. Mortimer was tried for treason and executed. Isabella was spared, confined to Castle Rising where she lived for the next 28 years. She wasn't imprisoned in the traditional sense. She had her own household, comfortable quarters, and could receive visitors. But she was finished as a political force. Edward III made it clear she would live, but only if she stayed out of politics entirely. Isabella died in 1358, having outlived her husband, her lover, and most of her contemporaries. She was buried at Greyfriars Church in London in her wedding dress, with Edward II's heart placed in her coffin. It's a romantic detail that seems strangely at odds with everything we know about their marriage. So what do we make of Isabella of France? The traditional view, the one immortalised in Shakespeare and countless histories, paints her as the she-wolf, a woman corrupted by power and sexual desire, who destroyed her husband and nearly destroyed England itself. That view has her as fundamentally evil, driven by ambition and lust to commit the ultimate betrayal. The revisionist view, increasingly popular among modern historians, sees Isabella as a victim who fought back. She was married at 12 to a man who publicly humiliated her, refused to consummate their marriage for years, and eventually allowed his favourites to strip her of her lands, her income, and her children. When she sought help from her own family, they couldn't or wouldn't protect her. So she took matters into her own hands, using the only tools available to her: foreign allies, a charismatic lover, and popular hatred of the dispensers. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in between. Isabella started as a victim, no doubt about that. But by the time she was invading England and deposing her husband, she'd become something else entirely. She'd become a player in the brutal game of medieval power politics, willing to do whatever it took to survive and protect her son's inheritance. Her affair with Mortimer was scandalous, but let's be honest, Edward's relationship with Gaveston and the dispensers was equally, if not more, scandalous. The difference was that when a king took male favourites, it was whispered about but ultimately tolerated. When a queen took a lover, it was treated as a crime against nature itself. Isabella's real scandal wasn't the affair, it was the invasion. It was the deposition. It was having the audacity to raise an army against her husband and win. Medieval society could, just barely, accommodate a queen who took a lover. It absolutely could not accommodate a queen who overthrew a king. That's why the she-wolf label stuck so thoroughly and lasted so long. Isabella didn't just break the rules, she tore up the entire rule book and wrote a new one. For our number one spot, we're going back further than any of the other queens on this list, all the way to the 6th century and the Merovingian kingdom of the Franks. And we're technically cheating a bit, because we're not talking about one scandalous queen, but two. Because the story of Brunhild and Fredegund is so intertwined, so mutually destructive, and so absolutely soaked in blood and betrayal that you can't understand one without the other. These are queens you've probably never heard of. They don't show up in Shakespeare. They don't get the Hollywood treatment. And that's a shame, because their 40-year rivalry makes the Wars of the Roses look like a minor family squabble. We're talking about decades of assassinations, civil wars, murdered kings, poisoned rivals, and political manoeuvring that would have made Machiavelli take notes. Let's set the scene. This is the Merovingian dynasty, ruling the Frankish kingdoms in the late 6th century. The Merovingians were Germanic peoples who'd conquered the former Roman province of Gaul and established a series of kingdoms that were constantly being divided, unified, and divided again among various royal brothers and sons. It was a system practically designed to generate conflict. The Merovingian dynasty also had very specific rules about women and power. Women could not inherit the throne or rule in their own right. They could only wield power as queens consort, as regents for underage sons, or through informal influence. This meant that any woman who wanted actual authority had to work through male relatives, and when those male relatives proved inconvenient, they had a habit of dying under mysterious circumstances. Brunhild enters the story first. She was born around 543, a Visigothic princess, daughter of King Athanagild of Hispania. She was educated, beautiful, and Catholic, all valuable qualities in a diplomatic marriage. Around 567, she was married to Sigebert I, King of Austrasia, one of the Frankish kingdoms. By all accounts, it was a successful marriage. Sigebert was cultured, reasonably competent, and genuinely seemed to care for his wife. But Sigebert had a brother, Chilperic I, king of Neustria, another Frankish kingdom. And this is where Fredegund enters the picture. Unlike Brunhild, who was a foreign princess of impeccable pedigree, Fredegund came from nowhere. The sources call her a slave, possibly captured in a raid, possibly born into servitude. She ended up in Chilperic's household as a servant, possibly to Chilperic's first wife, Audovera. What Fredegund lacked in noble blood, she made up for in ruthless intelligence and apparently considerable sexual charisma. She caught Chilperic's attention, became his mistress, and then systematically removed every obstacle between herself and the position of queen. First, she convinced Chilperic to send his wife Audovera to a convent, effectively annulling their marriage. This left the path clear for Chilperic to make a more advantageous diplomatic marriage. And this is where the two stories truly intertwine, because Chilperic decided to follow his brother's example and marry a Visigothic princess. Her name was Galswintha, and she was Brunhild's older sister. In 568, Galswintha married Chilperic and became Queen of Neustria. She brought an enormous dowry, solidifying Chilperic's position and creating an alliance between him and the Visigoths. Everything seemed perfect, except that Fredegund was still at court, still in the picture, still, apparently sleeping with Chilperic despite his new marriage. Galswintha, reasonably enough, found this situation intolerable. She complained to her husband, demanded that he choose between her and his mistress. She even offered to return to Hispania, taking her dowry back with her. On the morning of some day in the year 568 or 569, the exact date is unclear from the sources, Galswintha was found strangled in her bed. There was no investigation. There were no arrests. Chilperic claimed to have no idea what happened, though he seemed surprisingly unconcerned about his wife's murder. And just a few days later, he married Fredegund. Brunhild's reaction to her sister's murder was understandably volcanic. She knew exactly who was responsible. Fredegund had murdered Galswintha to clear her own path to the throne, and Chilperic had permitted it, possibly even ordered it. Brunhild demanded justice, demanded revenge, and when none was forthcoming through legal channels, she vowed to take it herself. This kicked off a 40-year blood feud that would consume both kingdoms and result in the deaths of multiple kings, countless nobles, and thousands of common soldiers. It wasn't just a rivalry between two queens. It was a war between two factions, two kingdoms, and two utterly implacable enemies who were willing to destroy anything and anyone to get at each other. The first major casualty was Sigebert, Brunhild's husband. In 575 he was assassinated by two servants who'd been bribed by Fredegund. They stabbed him with poisoned scrammus axes, short swords used by the Franks. Sigebert left behind a young son, Childebert II, and Brunhild immediately had herself appointed as regent. Being regent gave Brunhild real power for the first time, but it also made her vulnerable. Chilperic, seeing an opportunity to absorb Austrasia now that his brother was dead, invaded. He captured Brunhild and their children, and seemed poised to eliminate the threat they represented permanently. But Fredegund, showing either mercy or political calculation, allowed Brunhild to escape to Austrasia, where she rallied support and continued to rule as regent for her son. Was this mercy? Or did Fredegund want Brunhild alive so their rivalry could continue? We'll never know, but the result was that both queens survived to fight another day. The war continued through proxies, assassinations, and occasional open battles. Fredegund proved herself to be an absolutely brilliant military strategist, at one point personally leading an army against Brunhild's forces and winning. She wasn't sitting in a palace giving orders, she was riding a horse, commanding troops, making tactical decisions in real time. Fredegund also employed poison with remarkable frequency. Multiple sources accuse her of poisoning various enemies and rivals, including possibly some of her own children when they became inconvenient. Whether all these accusations are true is unclear, Poisoning was a common accusation levelled at powerful women in the medieval period, often without much evidence. But the sheer number of people around Fredegund who died suddenly and mysteriously suggests at least some of it was true. Meanwhile, Brunhild was playing her own game of assassination and political manoeuvring. She arranged marriages, formed alliances, and worked tirelessly to position her son, and later her grandsons, to dominate Frankish politics. She was educated and intelligent, often consulting with bishops and nobles on matters of law and governance. Sources describe her as exceptionally capable, possibly one of the most talented administrators the Frankish kingdoms had ever seen. But capable or not, she was also willing to remove obstacles permanently. When nobles opposed her policies, they had a tendency to die in convenient accidents. When her grandsons seemed inclined to listen to advisors other than her, those advisors found themselves exiled or worse. Fredegund died in 597. Having outlived multiple husbands and most of her children, her son Clothar II was still young, and without his mother's protection, he found himself facing Brunhild's full wrath. But Fredegund had prepared him well, and he proved to be as ruthless as his mother. Brunhild continued to rule for another 16 years, but her position was becoming increasingly precarious. She'd outlived her son and was now ruling through her great-grandson Sigebert II. But the Frankish nobility, never comfortable with female authority to begin with, was tiring of Brunhild's decades of dominance. When Clothar II, Fredegund's son, invaded Burgundy in 613, the nobles defected to him en masse. Brunhild, now around 70 years old, was captured, and Clothar, remembering everything Brunhild had done to his family, to his mother, and to him personally, decided she deserved a death that would send a message. The accounts of what happened next are brutal, even by medieval standards. Brunhild was tortured for 3 days. Then she was tied to a horse and dragged to death. Some versions say she was tied by her hair, others by her limbs, but all agree it was a deliberately agonizing death designed to destroy any dignity she might have maintained. It was the end of one of the longest and most violent rivalries in medieval history. 40 years of murder, betrayal, war, and destruction, all started by Fredegund strangling her predecessor in bed, and consolidated by Brunhild's determination to avenge her sister. So why don't we know their names? Why aren't there HBO dramas about Brunhild and Fredegund? Part of it is timing. They lived so early that the sources are sparse and often contradictory. But part of it is also that they were perhaps too scandalous, even for us. These aren't women who fought within the system or who could be romanticized as victims. These were women who murdered, poisoned, and destroyed their way to power, and held it through sheer ruthlessness for decades. They couldn't be domesticated into tragic heroines or misunderstood victims of patriarchy. They were just terrifying. And perhaps that's the most scandalous thing about them. Not any individual crime, but the fact that they succeeded for so long in a world designed to keep women powerless. The sources that do survive paint them both as essentially monstrous. Gregory of Tours, the main contemporary chronicler, portrays Fredegund as a low-born villain without morals, and while he's slightly more sympathetic to Brunhild initially, by the end of his chronicle he's condemning her as well. Later medieval writers picked up these characterizations and ran, with them turning both queens into cautionary tales about what happens when women get power. And that's the real scandal of Brunhild and Fredegund. Not that they were evil, though they almost certainly did commit terrible crimes. The scandal is that they were effective. They ruled, they won battles, they outlasted their enemies, and they shaped the politics of their era more than any of the kings who technically outranked them. For medieval society, that was the most unacceptable thing of all. We've journeyed through centuries of scandal, from the Merovingian kingdoms of the 6th century all the way to the Wars of the Roses in the 15th. We've met queens accused of witchcraft, incest, adultery, murder, and treason. We've seen women lead armies, invade countries, survive decades of imprisonment, and outlast enemies who seemed vastly more powerful. And we've seen how history has treated these women, transforming them into she-wolves, witches, and monsters. But as we pull back and look at the bigger picture, patterns emerge. These weren't evil women. They were women operating in an impossible system, a system where they were expected to be politically irrelevant, but also protect their children's inheritance, where they were supposed to be obedient wives, but also step in when their husbands proved incompetent or insane, where they were foreign-born outsiders brought in to create diplomatic alliances, but treated as suspicious infiltrators when they maintained connections to their homelands. Every single one of these queens faced a version of the same impossible choice. Accept powerlessness and watch everything you care about be destroyed, or fight for agency and be vilified as unnatural and monstrous. Think about Margaret of Anjou, accused of prolonging a civil war when all she was doing was defending her son's claim to the throne that legally belonged to him. Male nobles did the same thing constantly, fought for their family's inheritance, their dynastic rights, with nobody calling them she-wolves for it. Think about Joan of Navarre, accused of witchcraft not because she did anything wrong, but because her stepson wanted access to her wealth to fund his wars. The accusation was so transparently political that she wasn't even put on trial, just held until the money had been extracted. Think about Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose greatest crime was refusing to be limited by her gender in an era when simply being competent and ambitious was transgressive for a woman. She ruled territories, advised kings, and lived into her 80s still politically active, but she's remembered more for an alleged affair with her uncle than for her remarkable political career. Think about Isabella of France, married at 12 to a man who publicly humiliated her, finally fighting back after being stripped of everything she owned, but remembered as the she-wolf rather than as a woman who survived and protected her son against impossible odds. And think about Brunhild and Fredegund, who played the game of medieval power politics as brutally as any man, and arguably more successfully than most, but who have been almost entirely erased from popular historical consciousness because their success was too threatening to be remembered. The term she-wolf appears again and again in these stories. It's hurled at Margaret, at Isabella, it's implicit in the chroniclers' descriptions of Fredegund and Brunhild, and it's always meant as an insult, suggesting that these women have abandoned their humanity, their femininity, become something bestial and uncontrollable. But wolves are family-oriented, fiercely protective of their young, intelligent and strategic. They're also predators who do what's necessary to survive. Maybe the chroniclers who threw around that term chose more wisely than they knew. These queens were she-wolves, protecting their packs, eliminating threats, ensuring survival in a world that wanted them dead or powerless. The scandals themselves tell us more about medieval society than they do about the queens. When a queen was accused of witchcraft, it usually meant she had money or property someone more powerful wanted. When she was accused of adultery, it often meant she'd made political enemies who needed to destroy her reputation. When she was accused of being unnatural or overstepping her place, it usually just meant she was being competent at governance in a way that made powerful men uncomfortable. Modern historians have been rehabilitating these queens' reputations, examining the sources more critically, recognizing the gender bias baked into the chronicles, and trying to understand these women as complex political actors rather than as two-dimensional villains or victims. It's not about declaring them saints. They almost certainly all did things we'd consider morally wrong by modern standards. It's about recognizing that they were playing an impossible game with incomplete information and life or death stakes. What's remarkable isn't that some of these queens made brutal choices. It's that any of them survived at all. Medieval queenship was an impossible position. You had responsibility without authority, visibility without power, and you were held accountable for outcomes you often couldn't control. These 5 queens, and many others like them, found ways to carve out agency in a system designed to deny it to them. They used their intelligence, their connections, their wealth, and yes, sometimes their willingness to commit violence to protect themselves and their families. They became the wolves medieval society accused them of being, because being wolves gave them a chance to survive. As you drift off tonight, think about these women. Not as she-wolves or witches or monsters, but as human beings facing impossible situations. Think about the 15-year-old Eleanor of Aquitaine suddenly inheriting a duchy and navigating her way through 2 royal marriages and eventually 16 years of imprisonment. Think about the teenage Margaret of Anjou trying to govern a kingdom when her husband couldn't, taking up arms because nobody else would protect her son. Think about the 12-year-old Isabella watching her husband ignore her at her own wedding, and the middle-aged Isabella leading an invasion to reclaim her dignity. Think about Joan of Navarre accused of witchcraft in her 60s, Fredegund clawing her way from slavery to queenship, and Brunhild fighting for 40 years to avenge her sister. These weren't simple stories of good and evil. They were stories of survival, of the lengths people will go to protect themselves and their children, and of how history treats powerful women who refuse to be silent. The next time you hear someone call a powerful woman a she-wolf, remember where that term comes from. Remember Margaret of Anjou, Isabella of France, and all the other queens who were labelled monsters for daring to be effective. And remember that being a she-wolf, being fierce, protective, and dangerous when threatened, might not be a flaw at all. It might just be what survival looks like in a world that wants you powerless. Sleep well tonight, knowing that history is never as simple as the stories we tell, that the scandals of the past are often windows into the power structures of the time, and that sometimes the real scandal isn't what these queens did. It's what they had to do to survive in a world that should have destroyed them but didn't, because they were too smart, too determined, too fierce to be destroyed. They were queens who wore their crowns even when men tried to tear them off. They were women who rewrote the rules when the rules were designed to break them. They were, in the end, survivors, and that's the most powerful legacy of all.